All right, my name's Ryan Heldorn. I'm a landscape and wildlife and astrophotographer here in Sydney, Australia, and I recently purchased the Canon R3 with my own money, not sponsored in any way, shape, or form. A little bit of brief history about myself and my photography journey. I've been using Sony for around about 7 years now. Heavily invested in Sony and Sony glass. My first camera was actually the A7S II. 12 megapixels. I still use this all the time. This is one of my favorite time-lapse cameras because it still produces great 4K time lapses. It's great in low light for the sort of time lapses that I do. From there, I upgraded to the A7R3, which is what we're filming on right now. Purely using that as the video camera because, well, S2 still only has contrast detect, but if you get the autofocus right in terms of setting up your zones and everything, it's never been an issue for me for these sort of talking head videos. After the A7R3, I also got myself a A9. Couldn't say no to the speed. At 20 frames a second, 24 megapixels, it was light years ahead of everything else in the mirrorless world. And if we go through the lenses while we're at it, 55-1.8, the 20-1.8, the 24-1.4, 16 to 35 2.8, the 24 to 70 2.8, 90mm macro, 100 to 400, and the 135 GM. I've also owned a lot of, well, nearly all the f4 counterparts of the Trinity zooms, as well as I've also had the 70 to 200 2.8. Sold that lens because I just found I was using this more, and to be quite honest, that first iteration of Sony 70 to 200 2.8 just wasn't sharp at anything below 5.6. So what's the point of having a 2.8 if it's not going to be sharp at 2.8? So apparently the new version is a lot better and a lot lighter. I haven't had the chance to test that yet, so I can't really give an opinion on it. So why would I be considering swapping from Sony to Canon, and why have I bought the R3 considering I'm so invested in Sony and Sony glass? First things first, I've never liked the way the Sonys fit in my hand. I have big hands. If you'd like reference for my hand size, I wear a Hestra size 11. Nearly all my gloves that I have are Hestra. They've just never felt good in my hands. And when you have something like the 135 or the 24 to 70 on, the space between your the grip and the lens mount is so tight that if I'm wearing anything more than a light merino glove, which I do a lot of photography during winter, it doesn't feel comfortable in hand. It doesn't, more important, it doesn't feel secure. Granted, you've always got, so Peak Design, you've always got a strap on or something. It just doesn't instill that confidence. That's not to say that in the right hands, the Sony wouldn't be a better choice, but for me, it's always been troubling for me. So my biggest reason for looking at the R3 was I've rented a 1DX Mark III in the past. I enjoyed that, and the feeling in the hand feels amazing. Now, granted, I have also used the A7S II and the A1 with battery grips, and they feel substantially better, but still, I got that problem with the distance between the edge of the grip and the lens mount, and, well, the respective barrels of the lenses. Now, anyone who has a 1DX and is wondering whether to jump to the R3, I don't care what Canon says, the only thing that makes the 1DX more of a flagship is the weather sealing. I remember the buttons being a lot more, they all had their own little gaskets around it. The R3 tends not to have as many gaskets around the individual buttons. But for the weight saving, also note that even though I've got big hands, the 1DX actually fit my hand a lot better. It's just a little bit longer before you get to the vertical part of the built-in grip. So anyone who's coming from 1DX, just understand, I would go hold one. It's pretty hard to, I bought this on a lot of faith because I got this so early that they weren't actually around for me to sort of hold. So big leap of faith. But yeah, mainly the ergonomics. So I'm going to go off notes here. I'm going to try and keep this as organic as possible. So yeah, so that's been my big reason for testing out the Canon system. There's pros and cons to both systems for all different types of photography, and we'll sort of delve in a little bit on that as we go. First things first, people will want to compare this, the R3, to the A1, especially with the viewfinder. So the A1 has a miraculous 9.1 or 9.15 million dot EVF, but you got to remember that's at 60 frames per second. As soon as you bump it up to 120 frames per second FPS in the viewfinder, it drops to 5.1 million dots, which is exactly the same as this viewfinder. So this one runs, when you're running it at the smooth frame rate, runs at 120. It's beautiful to look through. It's crisp, it's clear, but that's not to say that the A1 and the A7 S3 aren't beautiful viewfinders in their own right. If you don't need the 120 frames per second, they're better EVFs. File size. So a lot of people look at file size, even though storage is becoming cheaper and cheaper these days. The R3 produced, I think it's about 23 megabytes for a 24 megapixel photo, which is pretty good, and that's shooting in uncompressed. And the best thing about the R3, if you're looking at in retrospect to the A1, uncompressed 30 frames a second in nearly every lens that I've tested on it. The A1, you'll only get 30 frames a second in the lossy compressed format. Now, I can't tell you what's the difference. I haven't noticed any major differences between uncompressed and the lossless compressed files, but I've never actually tested the lossy compressed files against uncompressed or the lossless compressed files. The file size on the A1 for 50 megapixels, I think it's about 120 for uncompressed, 60 for the lossless uncompressed, and then the lossy compressed, I think they're around about 50. So you're looking at almost double. Image stabilization, hands down, 8 stops. So I bought as well the 24 to 70 2.8. With the image stabilized, and I've also used the R3 with the 100 to 500, and to be completely honest, that 100 to 500 changed my mind about this camera. I wasn't that impressed until I whacked that lens on. Image stabilized, 8 stops. The best thing about it is you can actually set the camera to be always using image stabilization or during the shot. I'm pretty sure with the Sonys, it's only when you push the AF button. So I'm a back button focuser on the Sonys. So yeah, image stabilization only kicks in when you push the AF button. I've never really tested that on video, so please, if I'm wrong, please correct me in the comments. But this for video out at 500 mils is, I'll put some footage up of my fluffed stallion at 500 millimeters to show you how good it actually really is. But of course, we'll come back. Gerald Undone did a good video on his 5 good and bad points of the Canon R3. One of them being there's this drift in video mode, and we'll come back to that when we hit the video segment. All right. There's always been this complaint about Sony's and their menu system, and to be quite honest, I've never really had a problem with it. I'm the sort of guy that I'll go in, I'll learn the menu system, and then I'll set it up the way I want, and I very rarely have to go in, and anything that I need quickly I'll assign to the My menu, and then it's done and dusted, and then every progressive camera I get after that, I basically set up the same. Granted, the Canon menus are a lot more user-friendly, but where it falls down is nearly every function in a Sony camera is, nearly every function in a Sony camera is assignable to a button or to the function menu, or in Canon's case, that would be the quick function, the quick info menu, or whatever it's called. There are so many things that I wish you could assign to the quick menu on the Canon that you can't, and I think it's kind of its Achilles heel. One of them, I'd love to be able to assign the different cases for autofocus to a quick menu. I know you can do it to a button, but it'd be so much better just to have it in a quick menu. I know a lot of the pros out there are going to be saying, well, use your custom 1, custom 2, custom 3. I already set them up for the way I want them. So generally I have one for animals at speed. They're all set in manual. And then I'll have one for just nice quick flick it over so I'm not using such high shutter speeds for either people or animals again. Then I'll have one set up for like just general all-purpose. And if I could assign the cases to the quick menu, there's room for it. It's just for some reason Canon really limits on what you can actually assign to the quick menu. Other things that really bug me about the Canon's menu is some buttons don't do what they are supposed to do in every mode. And I'll come back and touch on that a little bit later when we talk about my gripes with the R3. Image quality. Now, the image quality on the R3 is superb. Now, I did a couple of unscientific tests. I took a photo of this table with a particular brass watch on it, with both the R3, the A9 and the A7 R3. Considering, I believe, even though it's a new 24 megapixel sensor, I would say it resolves somewhere between 24 and 30 megapixels. It's right on par with the A9. The A9 might be a touch softer, but that could be because it has a heavier anti-aliasing filter. The R3, of course, is miles ahead at 42 megapixels. But interestingly, the color shift in the A9 and the R3 was exactly the same. The Canon rendered just slightly warmer. Now, that can be quite desirable, but I found that the A9 and the R3 were a truer representation to the scene for this particular scene. Your mileage may vary scene to scene, use case to use case, but I just thought it was something interesting to note. All right, native versus adapted lenses. Now, I've used the 24 to 70, the 100 to 500, the 15 to 35 2.8, and I've also used a 70 to 200 EF version 2 lens. Now, interestingly, I got 30 frames per second on every single lens, even the EF lens. But what I found was that EF Mark II lens couldn't keep up with the autofocus, and even though the camera was saying it was in focus, only every third shot locked on. Every other, the two shots in between were always out of focus, and not just, they were out by quite a bit. So I purely think that was a limitation of the old EF 70 to 200 Mark II lens. But you're getting, and I checked on the time code, 30 frames per second with all four of those lenses. Absolutely remarkable. I'll put a scene up of my fluffiness running at me full pelt. I think the burst was around about 150 frames from memory. Every single one of them with the Canon 100 to 500 is tack sharp. And in saying that, I set the camera up to record video to the CF Express Type B card and then photos to the SD card. And I never really had a trouble with the buffer. I guess if you're spraying and praying all the time, you're going to have troubles with the buffer. But it writes pretty quick because they are only 23 megabyte files. It's not like the A1's trying to write like 60 or 120 megabytes per second, and the card speed is the bottleneck. Card speed is not really a bottleneck in this if you're going to use it the way I guess a normal sports and action or wildlife shooter would use it, instead of just spraying and paying and holding for longer than 5 seconds. Let's talk about the Canon cases and autofocus compared to the Sony. To be honest, if you're just looking for a lock and load system, I think the Sony is more intuitive and easier to use because you can just set your zone up. The facial and eye focus on both cameras is about the same. Even comparing it to my A9, they're about the same. The A1 will probably be a step up again, but again, you'd be picking at straws. I find the cases overcomplicated. Now, granted, there are use cases for, no pun intended, for each case of the autofocus, but I find maybe having too much selection in the autofocus could be a deterrent, or it might take away from the shooting experience. I think you get good enough results with, say, the A9 or the A9 II or the A1, just using your zones and setting whether you want it to be all the way at locked on or all the way at responsive. Whereas this sort of gives you only 3 levels of the locked on or responsive in photo anyway. And then you'd select your cases. Now, in the example I used before with Kai running at me, I used case 3 because it's just the fastest at locking on whatever the focus point is locked on at that time. Anytime that you've got someone disappearing behind other people or other animals, you're probably going to use something like case 2. But even then, I find they need tweaking and they're not always going to work the way you want them. So that's why it's kind of like the Sonys in that regard, where I can just have it locked on or semi-locked on or not locked on and very responsive to the changing scene. I just find it a little bit easier. That's not to say one is better than the other. I think it's just a preference when it comes to using it. But like I said, the autofocus experience on the R3 is just, it hands down beats the Sonys in terms of being involved in the shooting experience. I like to use the analogy of there's no point having the best supercar in the world if you don't enjoy driving it. If it's a mug of a thing to drive, then you're just not going to enjoy the experience, no matter how fast it goes or how well it corners. If you just don't enjoy it, what's the point? So that's not to say I don't enjoy the shooting experience with Sony. It's all I've known for like the last 7 years. But yeah, once again, it's going to be user preference. All right, so let's look at a couple of the things that I don't like about the Canon. One of the main things is if a button is labeled as something, I think it should be used in that regard for every mode. And my point with this one is the exposure compensation dial on the top. It doesn't work as exposure compensation in manual. I don't understand why. I'm sure the Canon people are going to have an absolute ball in the comments with this, but when you push it in manual mode, all it does is let you change the shutter speed and the aperture, and I can do that in any way with the dial setup. So I've been using Sony, I use my front dial for aperture, the back one for shutter speed, and then the rear one for ISO. It basically comes down to muscle memory. I want to, no matter if I'm in aperture priority, shutter priority, manual, I want the same button to do the same job. Instead of, sure, there's ways around it. You can, for exposure compensation, you can half press the shutter button and use the focus ring on the multifunction ring on the front of the lens, which is another problem because they're in different places on different lenses. So the 24-70 and the 15-35 are at the front, whereas on the 70-2, I think it's the 70-200, or I know it is on the 100-500, it's back towards the lens. So once again, your muscle memory is changing all the time. So it's not lens specific, it's not camera button specific, it's sort of, and yes, I know there's another way where you can push the set button on the back and then use the roller. That's fine, that's what I've been doing, but I'd like some congruency and some consistency on no matter what mode I'm in, everything's still the same, or at least the option to. Like I iterated before, with the Sony cameras, nearly every setting you could possibly think of, you can assign to the function menu or to the or a custom button in many regards. Same thing with if you're in auto ISO, if you're using manual, so you're controlling aperture and shutter, but you just want to take it a bit easier and rely on auto ISO to do the job. When you come out of auto ISO, you have to wait for the camera to start metering before you can put it back. Whereas on the Sony cameras, if I accidentally bump the back wheel for ISO, I can quickly scroll it all the way back to the left and it automatically goes straight back into auto. Granted, yes, there are quick ways around. Again, you can push the quick menu button twice, but again, I've got to take my finger off my AF focus button to push it twice. Once again, it's personal preference. You use a system for so long, there's always going to be differences, but some things just don't make sense to me at some times. All right, let's move on to a couple of the great ergonomic functions of the R3. Smart control is amazing. I love it. I loved it on the 1DX Mark III. The good thing is you can set it to just either stay in the center and just work as a AF on point, or you can actually have it be, for its intended purpose, to be able to move it around the sensor or the viewfinder to be exactly where you want the focus to be. Like I said, you can lock it on and just use it as an AF on and then just focus and recompose. Sometimes that's a better option depending on what you're shooting. Now, I just wanted to quickly come back and touch on one of the big autofocus differences that I've noticed between this and just the A9 itself was on a static subject that barely moves, the A9 or the Sony system is much stickier. It's almost like the R3 is waiting for extra movement. It's waiting for something to move around the frame, so it will jump. Even in the most locked on, stickiest settings, if I focus on, say, someone and it can't lock onto the eye, say sort of like the side of the head or something, but an arm moves off in the side, it will move. It won't stay on the original focus point, and that doesn't matter what focus area you choose. You can use the smallest spot or the wide or everything in between. It's just not as sticky on static subjects when there's other objects moving in the frame. That being said, yeah, so once again, the AF on multi-selection button is amazing. I love the quick flick switch from video into, from photo into video. And I like the fact that when I'm in photo, I can push that record button and it automatically records whatever I've registered as my C3 for video, which is, I usually use the 4K 120 frames a second. Of course, there's always going to be limitations with that, like you've quickly got to adjust your exposure on the fly because it starts recording automatically from those saved settings. Unless, of course, you've got auto ISO, but if you haven't got an ND filter on because you've been doing photography, well, you can understand where you're going to be at. Talking about video, the video on it is gorgeous. The 4K, so we're in Australia here, so I use 4K 25 and 50 and 100 FPS. It's beautiful. The 100 or 120 frames per second is slightly softer, but I still believe Canon is well behind Sony in the slow motion department, because the Sony, the A7S II, the 120 is a lot better. It's a lot sharper, and Canon still can't give you audio in 120, whereas Sony can do it in way back in the A7S II. So granted, a lot of people don't use audio in slow motion, but sometimes when you do things like speed ramps, it's handy to have the audio leading into it and out of it, of course. But once again, personal preference, your mileage will vary. The 6K RAW is good. It's interesting, it's sharp. I'm editing on a brand new M1 MacBook Pro Max, maxed out except for the hard drive. The 6K RAW light footage drops a few frames in Final Cut Pro, because I use Final Cut Pro, and it's the only time I actually hear those fans kick on, and they stay on. So the 6K RAW footage in the light variant, the C-RAW Lite, is quite taxing on the brand new MacBook Pro Maxes with the M1s. I haven't tried the 6K RAW because, well, it just the file sizes are too big. All right. Okay, Gerald Undone alluded to video wobble, and when I watched his video, I didn't really notice what he was trying to get across until I picked this up, and I'll try and overlay some footage here. I know what's happening, so you're not going to get the video wobble unless there's movement in the camera. So if I start off with the camera sort of just a small pan from there to there, what actually happens when you get to the end point, the sensor keeps moving to decelerate, and I think it's part of the 8 stops of IBIS. It's using a deceleration algorithm to sort of slow down, but it just also means that you have to compensate for that if you're trying to finish with something in the middle of the frame, because it will sort of almost go past it a little bit. You'll notice it in the video that I put up. It's just a very basic example of it. But he's already alluded to that, and well done, Gerald, for picking that up. The other point that Gerald made was, and it's really annoying, is when you start recording, you lose your histogram in video. which is really annoying when you're going through different changes in lighting sources, etc. Different dynamic ranges for a scene. At the end of the day, the R3 is marketed as a sports, wildlife and journalism camera. People doing video on those are going to go through different lighting scenarios in the same take. And when you lose your histogram, I don't rely on the metering at all. Another problem that I've found in video is you can't have zebras and manual focus peaking on at the same time. It'll actually tell you in the menus when you go to put zebras on that you can't have it based on your selection for manual focus. So you actually have to turn the focus peaking off to get zebras. It'd be, obviously this might be a viewfinder or screen issue where you can't have them both on at the same time for some particular reason, but Sony's can do it. So, all right, let's go into one of my biggest gripes, and this could be the one reason why I will put this on the used market unless Canon actually does something about it. Now, this isn't just related to the R3. I believe this is in Canon's entire mirrorless and DSLR setup selection, and that is the auto minimum ISO settings. Now, on the Sonys, and like, well, people go, well, what do you care about auto minimum ISO for? I shoot a lot of time lapses, and I shoot a lot of time lapses where not only is the scene the subject, but myself in the scene is the subject. I'll overlay maybe one or two of those so you can get an understanding. And most professionals will say, well, just shoot them in manual. Well, that's not always the best option for someone who's also the subject of their time lapse. So you can't keep coming back around. Now, a lot of my time lapses go from day to night. So we do camping scenes where we do setups, and then we go into the night and have Milky Way or full moon or whatever. What I've been able to do in the Sonys all the way back from my A7S II is set an auto minimum ISO at, say, if I know it's going to go into a nighttime scene, where I'll have the 21.8 on, I'll have the aperture set at f2 or f2.2, I'll have the ISO set to auto with a maximum of 3200 ISO, and then I'll have the shutter speed set to an auto minimum ISO of 15, and then I'll run a 15-second interval. And then I can basically just set and forget, provided that the camera doesn't get condensation or snow or anything like that on it. The Canon doesn't allow you to do that. The Canon only lets you go down to 1 second of auto minimum ISO, which is a big deal breaker for me. And when I reached out to Canon Australia, they said, well, we can take care of the interval thing. You go into the orange menu and you set your maximum, your minimum shutter speed up to go to a certain length, but that only takes care of the interval part. What'll still happen is if I have it in, set it to 1 second minimum ISO, it'll get to 1 second, and as the light changes, the ISO will creep up till it hits the maximum ISO that you set, and then it will start to drag the shutter speed. Now, the problem with that is you end up getting noisier images a lot earlier on in, say, blue hour than you'd have much cleaner, whereas if it was at 1 second and at 3200 ISO, I'm looking at staying at almost 200 ISO and an 8-second exposure, much cleaner images. So that's almost, I think it could actually be the Achilles heel and the thing that actually stops me from fully transitioning to Canon, which is a real shame because this is something that can be easily fixed with software and firmware update. It's not a hardware limitation. But yeah, it's something that really bugs me about it. And it's something that's been offered on every other manufacturer's systems for an extensive period of time. Like I said, it's in the A7S II, which is what, 6-7 years old now. All right, good points, extra good points. The Canon app for, say, if you're using it for wireless remote triggering. Compared to the Sony, say goodbye to Sony. The imaging app for Sony is one of the worst camera apps, or for that matter, one of the worst apps I've ever used on iPhone, period. It is, you lose control of the camera, the Wi-Fi drops out, The settings you have to go through to change. So if I'm doing, say, an environmental portrait where I want to be able to see myself in the frame holding before I can, and it's too far for me to use, say, a 10-second timer, or I'm too far away for a remote trigger to work. Because I'm a back button focuser, I have to disconnect that and connect it back to the shutter, so the shutter will autofocus on me in the frame before it takes a shot. Now, granted, you can use manual focus and take care of that yourself, but you've got to provide where you know you're going to be in the frame. Anyone who's been on the Sony system for long enough and has used the imaging app will tell you it's rubbish. It is a biggest bag of crap for a camera system or a technology company that I've ever come across. It doesn't even do things that it says it does, like touch focus. The Canon one, the Canon utility app, or I think it's called, touch focus, change from change focusing modes, change from photo to video on the fly, much more stable connection over a much longer distance. It's night and day, much better than compared to the Sony. Sony drops the ball on this so hard, it's not funny with regards to this. Okay, other things that might be stopping me transitioning, and look, on the same time, Sony was in the same boat 4 or 5 years ago, is the lack of RF lenses. So we've got the Holy Trinity, which is good. The 100 to 500 is a lens that I definitely pick up. They have a wonderful 50 and 85mm primes. Well, there's actually two 85mm primes, depending on your taste. But there's still a shortage of wide angle primes, 35, 20, 24. I'd love a 135, a new Canon 135 RF. It's one of my favorite lenses on the Sony system. That lens on the A9 or an A9 II or an A1, oh, absolutely astonishing lens. So yeah, a lack of RF, but once again, Sony was in the same boat a couple of years ago, and it's always you're going to get that on a new system. But yeah, that's pretty much about it in terms of, look, if I had to sum it up, if the R3, if Canon can actually introduce longer auto minimum ISO, all we need is 2, 4, 8, 15 and 30 seconds to add it to the auto minimum ISO, I will leave Sony. I'll tell you that right now. People go, you've got a 42 megapixel Sony, or the A1's 50 megapixels, 24 is not enough. For most people, absolutely, it's more than enough. Unless you're making big prints, and if I look at the hundreds of thousands of photos I've taken, I've only ever printed maybe half a dozen full-size A1 prints. And you can still print an A1 from 24 megapixels and still have wonderful detail in it, especially with the enhancements in Lightroom with super resolution. Yeah, 24 megapixels is enough. But yeah, should Canon fix that auto minimum ISO shutter speed issue, I'd love for the exposure compensation to always be an exposure compensation button regardless of what mode I'm in. It would be enough for me to probably sell all my Sony stuff and transition to Canon. But as it is at the moment, considering I'm sort of gravitating towards wanting just that one camera to do everything for me, good video, good autofocus, good speed, good resolution, good time-lapse function, at the end of a true hybrid camera, it kind of still falls a little bit short, mainly because of the inability to do time-lapse. And I know there's going to be a lot of pros out there who say, but you do time-lapse in manual. Like I explained, that doesn't really work for me. Also, I use a lot of motion control, like the syrup motion controllers and Slingshot. That's just not feasible half the time. Last thing you want to do is be constantly changing camera settings on a moving system, especially if you're setting up, say, 15-second exposures going into the night, and you've got a 20-second interval. You've got 5 seconds to touch the camera. And yes, I could use the app, but once again, it's another thing in the chain that I have to do on a system that would be so easy to just have a set and forget. Flicker is not really an issue anymore with time lapses. If you're using something like LR time lapse, you don't really have to worry about flicker anymore. So using aperture priority, especially like I said, for me, where I am part of the subject of the scene, I can't be coming back around behind the camera. So that's a big deal breaker for me. But user experience for everything outside of that, it's been fantastic. I love the flip screen. I don't know why Sony didn't put it on the A1. A lot of people also say, why didn't the A1 come with a pro level body? I can understand why Sony kept it the same, so there was congruency between the line. People also want the option to have a smaller form factor, or they can put a grip on. I know with my time lapses, quite often I will take the grip off if I'm using my syrup slingshot, because it's just a lighter payload. But yeah, Canon fixed the auto minimum shutter speed, and I will transition completely. The user experience, the feeling in the hand, the ergonomics, and also add the ability to assign cases to the quick menu, so we can swap cases quickly. But yeah, that's about it. I'm sure there are many Canon users out there that are going to roast me in the comments saying you can do this, you can do that. This is all a learning experience for me, just like it was for you at one stage. There's not a lot of this information online. I have been engrossed in Sony for the last 7 years. I've loved using Sony. Like I said, the limitations of the Sony system have come down to the ergonomics and the way it feels in the hand. But that's not the be all and end all. At the end of the day, most people will take image quality over it, and in today's day and age, I don't think image quality is a massive deal unless you're printing big prints. But yeah, it'll be interesting to see what the R1's going to be. But yeah, I hope you got a lot out of this. I hope I've given you some insight into the difference between the Sony and the Canon, and pitfalls from both systems. And yeah, any questions, leave them in the comments below. Want to roast me, go ahead, just don't be a dick about it. And yeah, maybe we'll do an update in a month or so if we get a firmware update for the R3. Get out and get shooting.